I don't know about you guys, but lately I've been seeing more takes online about how Fire Emblem is dying than usual, citing Fire Emblem Heroes losing its player base, no more games scheduled for the Switch, and well, something about Engage. And more to the point of this video, the series losing its relevancy as if new Fire Emblem games have as fast of a turnaround as literally any other major Nintendo IP. This video wasn't made to talk about that sentiment. That might be for another opinion video, but what that sentiment did make me wonder was, how relevant is Fire Emblem as a series anyway? And by relevancy, I mean widespread recognition, niche versus mainstream, which is what this casual editorial video will discuss today. This is going to include my personal feelings on the series and how I grew up treating it to where we are today, all these years later. But first, a message from today's sponsor, Sword of Convaleria, a brand new fantasy tactical RPG available to play right now. Journey through Iria, a mineral-rich country whose magical resources have drawn unwanted attention from dangerous external factions. As tensions rise and riots break out, it's up to you, as a mercenary leader, to figure out ways to save the country. This game contains a deep, 120-hour-long, choice-based narrative with multiple endings, bolstered by music produced by Hitoshi Sakimoto, the composer behind legendary games like Tactics Ogre, Final Fantasy XII, the Final Fantasy Tactics series, and Valkyria Chronicles. Containing both a gacha and single-player campaign, you can either dive into Spiral of Destinies, the main single-player quest, or that of the gacha, which contains character side stories for you to better get to know the backgrounds of whom you acquire. In this game, you must strategize in a 2.5D map by making use of your assembled heroes' skills and stats, their specific class and movement abilities, and this game's take on the weapon triangle. And it uses the classic RPG-like system where agility will determine turn order. The various obstacles in your way, like crates, gunpowder, barrels, and boulders scattered throughout the battlefield, can be used to gain positional advantages and as an extra form of damage. The game is now available on PC and mobile. Click the link in the description and pinned comment to download Sword of Convaleria now, and use gift code SOCCREATOR to receive in-game rewards. And thank you, Sword of Convaleria, for sponsoring today's video. Fire Emblem most definitely began as a niche game. Over in Japan, it had cult classic status for having engaging strategic gameplay and focusing on characters and story. As the series became more popular, especially around Mystery of the Emblem, its identity as the strategy RPG was recognized among Super Famicom fans. While not pulling in sales numbers to the likes of Final Fantasy, other game developers, including them, were recognizing the unique gameplay and story presentation. With the advent of Marth and Roy in Melee, the West had finally at least heard of this series, and thanks to the success of Intelligent Systems' other SRPG, Advance Wars, Nintendo had the confidence to bring these games overseas as well. If it weren't for the success of Advance Wars, we would totally not have Fire Emblem here. But for SRPGs, you've got to know the rules before you start. So with Advance Wars, even though there wasn't a plan to release it outside Japan, we made it really easy to play. We put a really good tutorial in, so people didn't need to read the manual. And when the US marketing people played it, they came to us and said, "But this is great, why can't we sell it over here?" And it seems that Advance Wars' success shifted Nintendo's attitude over Western tastes. With Fire Emblem being the first turn-based SRPG for a lot of kids in the West, if they didn't even know Advance Wars existed, like in my case, what was it like to play? Alright, story time. But straight up, for me as a 10 or 11-year-old, I didn't know what the fuck was going on. I mashed A to skip the seemingly surface-level story, I understood the broad strokes, and I was more focused on using Lyn, Sane, Eliwood, Pent, Hawkeye, characters with cool animations, and their very colorful portraits, and the occasional support conversations with two characters I liked that, for some reason, could talk to each other. I didn't really know what was going on, but that is what kept me engaged. In other words, I barely read anything. Even for gameplay, I didn't even finish the game at first. I distinctly remember just outright stopping my campaign on Cog of Destiny. I was just frustrated at the difficulty. I had lost key units, and I'm almost certain I just fed Marcus too much, because how am I supposed to know what a Jagan is? How difficult must it have been to sell this concept at first? Without the success of Advance Wars, Nintendo would think the West would have zero interest in the genre altogether. It's a genre that is innately difficult. Beyond the quote-unquote math of rock, paper, scissors, and the weapon and magic triangles, there is actual math involved. I just threw units around, didn't understand how attack speed worked, and all in all didn't really pay attention to anything because I didn't really know what to look for or how to calculate how terrain bonuses work. On top of that, so much narrative and writing was ignored by my stupid 11-year-old brain. The series and SRPGs, whether they are turn-based or real-time strategy, just innately have a higher skill floor than other games and genres. Like, without the success of Advance Wars, Nintendo would think the West would have zero interest in the genre altogether, and not even be good at it. I was told that these kinds of games would never be successful abroad, because they were turn-based games, and turn-based games weren't appreciated outside Japan. But we decided it because these kinds of games were too complicated. People are used to action games and shooting games, and in those all you have to do is press the A button and B button, and you'll soon understand how to play. Then throw on all the exposition and still moving portraits, and yeah, it sounds like it shouldn't be very appealing to the masses. At least I can see how they would think that. And I'm not kidding you when I say back in middle school I was the only one who played this game. But thankfully, Intelligent Systems and Nintendo realized that the West actually wasn't too dumb to appreciate SRPGs. And FE7 went on to become one of the best-selling games in the entire series, selling really close to 1 million units both at home and abroad. Without Melee, I would not be here right now, so advertising paid off incredibly well for them. Sadly though, the units sold went lower and lower, and Nintendo's notoriously lazy advertising was not helping an already small market. Then Fire Emblem stopped for Westerners after Shadow Dragon. It doesn't surprise me that an SRPG without good advertising just didn't do well, and I wonder if that may have further solidified the sentiment that Fire Emblem just wasn't appealing enough to the Nintendo demographic. And so this niche franchise was to go back to Japan and stay there with FE12. Time skip to 2013, and heavy focus on casual appeal both in gameplay and outside the grid became a huge priority for the series since. Casual mode, a self-insert, charming and lighthearted characters who you could marry and have kids with, and precisely 1 million homages to past games and characters. Awakening, as we all know, blew up sales like mad and saved the series, inviting a new demographic of gamers and welcoming the old crowd who could understand all these references. The casualization, and I don't mean this demeaningly, of the series kept being focused on. New Mystery may not have sold well, but the ideas were introduced there, My Unit and casual mode, and they showed potential. With Awakening blowing the doors open, IS would continue pushing these game-simplifying and non-genre defining mechanics and ideas. Phoenix mode, My Castle, and,
allow me to show you the depth of my affection. I hope that was sufficient.
Advertising was also in full force for these titles, even more so with 3 Houses being released during the Switch's prime, having tons of advertising, humongous focus on narrative and characters bolstered by professional voice acting, and casual gameplay elements of its own in the Persona-esque calendar system, tea time, and a ton of activities to do outside of battle. The non-linear nature of progression and open-ended map layouts made the gameplay straightforward like it was with Awakening. This game, like its 3DS-era brethren, wasn't rigidly defined by the genre, and sure as shit didn't express it that way either. This direction carried through with Engage, with even more ideas like this, but making the chapter-by-chapter gameplay significantly more interactive, and in my opinion, better. All of these appeals to attraction, from making the game easier, and its prioritization on its sim and social elements is what makes Fire Emblem so much different than other games in the strategy and tactical RPG space. It's not just a story, character, and gameplay focused experience, it's a you-focused experience too. It's more appealing than its contemporaries because of the features that aren't traditional for the genre, and effectively creates its own subgenre within it, by being both a social sim and a tactical war sim. And its success is redefining what can be in a strategy and tactical RPG. So with all of Fire Emblem's success now being Nintendo's #1 title for strategy and tactics, outselling other iconic Nintendo franchises, why, realizing this, that I can't shake my biases and it still feels so niche to me? Is this mainstream appeal not enough? I then realized, after some thinking, the genre itself is still niche because turn-based SRPGs will always be niche. Fire Emblem just happens to be the most well-known of them. So how big of a fish and how small of a pond are we talking about? Or is that even the case anymore? As the series enjoyed its 4.1 million copies sold of Three Houses as of 2022, and engages weaker performing but still noteworthy 1.6 million units as of March 2023, the end of Nintendo's fiscal year, the franchise currently sits among the top 20 best-selling RPGs at 16th place according to the VG Sales Wiki. Now, with a grain of salt, not every series started in 1990 like Fire Emblem did, and games like World of Warcraft listed here under Fire Emblem isn't including the expansions, because if it did, yeah. Even though Fire Emblem's placement here might not be 100% accurate, the main takeaway is that it sits high in the list. Its placement in the genre goes to show how relevant it is as far as RPGs are concerned, even more so as it's the only SRPG in the list. It's impressive, but what I find more interesting is comparing how a 16th place SRPG fares against its own fellow major IPs of Nintendo. Fire Emblem is Nintendo's 18th best-selling franchise, narrowly behind Metroid. A decent chunk of these IPs haven't been active on the Switch, and so when we account for only active on-Switch franchises, Fire Emblem sits at 14th. But if you split Mario into these 5 subcategories and count them separately, we're now down to 19th. Regardless though, being a top 20 at worst on the Switch is really impressive. Take into consideration that Three Houses, being the series' strongest selling and most culturally influential game ever, is the 34th best selling game on the console. It's a remarkably great placement. So this can't possibly still be niche, right? And where is the line between mainstream and niche? How do you parse between one and the other? It's tough to define in my opinion, but to me, Fire Emblem is mainstream, but the genre itself isn't. I'm going to crudely compare Fire Emblem and Three Houses to other SRPGs and other big selling relevant games in the genre to attempt to put things into more perspective, if not just for my own sake. And I'm not a statistician or anything, these are just surface level observations, so I don't claim to be like a super genius. I failed stats in university, so there you go. XCOM is another SRPG/TRPG that is decently well known. If you watch the channel regularly and are into the genre, it's likely you at least heard of it. Its most recent mainline game, Chimera Squad, released in 2020, and the series had a gacha of its own in 2021. In totality though, the series has sold 5.55 million units, nowhere close to Fire Emblem's total, and still rising 20.7 million. Project Triangle Strategy was a widely revered and successful SRPG as well. Since its release in 2022, it has sold over 1 million units, which is less than what Engage has sold in more time as of right now, and is roughly similar to Echoes' Three Hopes and the original FE Warriors' sales. Pikmin, which is not a turn-based strategy and more of an RTS, which won Strategy Game of the Year, has sold a very strong 3.48 million units since basically around this time last year. And it's possible that it can sell even more and catch up closer to Three Houses, assuming that Three Houses stops selling altogether. But the games are nonetheless not at that point. And don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing Three Houses to these games to demean them in any way. The point I'm trying to make is that Fire Emblem just cannot be considered niche. Pikmin is often considered niche. It has a smaller fan base and a strong following. If we start to consider Fire Emblem niche still, does that make Pikmin or XCOM super niche? Fire Emblem has had multiple spin-off titles, cameos in other games, 2 higher than average selling Warriors games, and Nintendo's most successful spin-off game by an absolute landslide for 7 years running that has raked in over $1 billion in revenue that advertises the series in of itself. And in case you didn't know, a gacha running for 7 years in what seems like to be an era of end-of-service announcements is very impressive. Not to mention a disproportionately high number of Smash Bros. Representatives in 8. You only get these accomplishments by being a mainstream title. In my opinion, from someone playing since 2003, it's understandable that someone could think the series still holds niche status if they grew up surrounded by the sentiment, especially when considering its origins in Japan as a cult classic series before coming here. It's also possible to feel this way when one might compare Fire Emblem's sales figures to its contemporaries like Pokemon, Zelda, and Mario, like I used to do. But the thing is, those 3 series are so disproportionately more widely known and successful than literally every other Nintendo major IP ever. So it's a comparison not even worth making. Fire Emblem is just a small fry. Like I talked about before, SRPGs and TRPGs, if you think there's a gameplay difference, are harder to get into and take longer to make. Fire Emblem just kinda paved its way as a subgenre of a subgenre at this point. Again, I'm not here to draw an official line between what makes something widely considered niche or mainstream, but you definitely aren't a hipster for playing Fire Emblem nowadays is all I'm saying. It's fun to think about though. It's going to take a lot in my opinion for another game to eclipse Three Houses. The circumstances around its release, its replayability, the cameos it's in, all the spin-offs, the cultural impact and continued relevance just doesn't seem like something that can be surpassed or replicated. But I mean, it could happen onto the Switch 2 in prime time with a bunch of crazy cool announcements and Alear being in Smash 6, who knows? It can continue staying relevant without brand new universes, and instead sticking with remakes if they wanted to. Echoes had to facelift quite literally everything about Gaiden. Its graphics, gameplay mechanics, characters, and story. It also included voice acting in full, so FE might suffer from infrequent releases compared to other major Nintendo IPs that I mentioned above, but being able to rehash old games is still an asset. Not that they're living and dying by mainline releases anyway. Fire Emblem Heroes is still raking millions for them. Anyway, the point of this video was to discuss Fire Emblem's niche origins and my personal experience and biases around its status as a game, to how it acquired its mainstream recognition. It's a topic that was fun to explore, and it's crazy to think about how Fire Emblem's fate hinged on the success of specific games like it did. I mean, everyone knew about Awakening, but Advance Wars before everything? I didn't even know that until this video. That's kind of all I wanted to talk about today. So my question to you all is, when you started playing Fire Emblem, how did you feel about it? If you started with FE7 back in the early 2000s, do you feel similar to me right now? Please let me know in the comments down below. And I'd like to give a massive thank you for my patrons whose monthly pledges help me greatly when I'm not feeling the best or I'm unable to produce content. If you want to support my channel, please consider checking out the Patreon down below. The Soldier tier is just $1. A thankful shout out goes to my $15 month Great Lord patrons, who are Based Gumi, Atsi, Verdant Pickle, Manthian, Raven King, Zythid, Kevin the Nerd, Nobu, Saxy, Arkholt, M Farmtown, Adelaide, PX44, Kelby, Kobo Redive, Silver-Haired Freak 25, Prime Fusion, Skyla, and for Muzzle. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Deuces.